I was just a waitress trying to pay for graduate school when I served a billionaire who was about to spend $100 million on what I knew was a fake document. I risked everything to stop him. "It's a forgery," I whispered. "How do you know?" he asked. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, what's your dream job? Drop it in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more amazing stories every day. Now let me take you back to the night that changed my life forever. The dinner rush at Le Bernardin was always intense, but tonight felt different. I was balancing 3 plates of the chef's signature dish when my manager, Marcus, pulled me aside with an expression I'd never seen before, part excitement, part terror. "Tina, I need you to handle the Rothschild room tonight," he said, referring to our most exclusive private dining space. "VIP client, extremely high profile. Everything has to be perfect." "Of course," I said, though my heart sank a little. Private dining meant longer hours, and I had a paper on Renaissance art authentication due tomorrow that I hadn't even started. "I mean it, Tina. This client could or make this restaurant. One mistake, one spilled drink, one wrong word, and we're all looking for new jobs." I nodded, straightening my uniform and checking my appearance in the hallway mirror. At 24, I'd been working at Le Bernardin for 2 years, saving every penny to pay for my graduate degree in art history at Columbia. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days studying priceless masterpieces and my nights serving overpriced food to people who could afford to buy those masterpieces. The Rothschild room was our crown jewel, a private dining space that could seat 12, but tonight was set for only 4. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany paneling and original oil paintings that were probably worth more than most people's houses. As I entered to do a final check of the table settings, I caught a glimpse of the guests through the partially open door. 3 men in expensive suits were already seated, but it was the 4th man who made me pause. Harrison Cox. Even someone like me, who lived paycheck to paycheck, recognized one of the world's most successful billionaires. He looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet intensity that came from wielding enormous power. Cox was famous for his art collection, one of the most significant private collections in the world, housed in a museum-quality facility that few people had ever seen. "Tina?" Marcus appeared beside me, his voice tight with nerves. "They're ready for you." I entered the room with the practiced smile I'd perfected over 2 years of fine dining service. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'm Tina, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Cox looked up from a leather portfolio he'd been studying, and I was struck by his eyes, sharp, analytical, the eyes of someone who missed nothing. "Thank you, Tina," he said, his voice cultured but warm. "We'll be conducting some business during dinner, so we may need extra time between courses." "Of course, sir. Take all the time you need." As I served the first course, I couldn't help but notice the tension in the room. This wasn't a casual business dinner. This was something significant. The other 3 men were clearly dealers or experts of some kind, and they kept referring to documents in their briefcases with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. "The provenance is absolutely unquestionable," one of them was saying as I poured wine. "We've traced it back through 6 different collections over the past 4 centuries." "And the authentication?" Cox asked. 3 independent experts have verified it. The ink analysis, the parchment dating, the calligraphy. Everything checks out perfectly." I was trying not to eavesdrop, but certain words caught my attention. Authentication, provenance. These were terms I lived and breathed in my graduate studies. During the second course, one of the dealers opened a flat, climate-controlled case and carefully removed what appeared to be an ancient manuscript. Even from across the room, I could see it was beautiful. Illuminated letters in gold and deep blues, the kind of medieval artwork that made my heart race. "Gentlemen," the dealer said with obvious pride, "I present the Lost Codex Aureus of Saint Emmeram." I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. The Codex Aureus of St. Emmeram was legendary in art history circles, a 9th century illuminated gospel book that had disappeared from a German monastery during World War II. If this was authentic, it would be worth, well, there was no price you could put on it. It was priceless. The asking price, the dealer continued, is $100 million. Cox leaned forward, studying the manuscript with the intensity of a man who had spent decades collecting the world's most precious artifacts. May I examine it more closely? As the dealer carefully moved the manuscript to Cox's side of the table, I found myself with a clear view of the document for the first time. What I saw made my blood run cold. The illumination was exquisite, the gold leaf work masterful, the overall composition breathtaking. To most people, it would look like the genuine article, but I wasn't most people. I was the granddaughter of Dr. Edmund Bailey, one of the world's foremost experts on medieval manuscripts, until his career was destroyed by a forger so skilled that even the experts couldn't detect his work. My grandfather had spent the last 10 years of his life obsessed with the man who had ruined him, Viktor Kozlov, a man who had created forgeries so perfect they had fooled museums, collectors, and authentication experts around the world. Grandpa had tried to expose Kozlov, but without concrete proof, his accusations had been dismissed as the ravings of a bitter old man whose own authentication had been proven wrong. But Grandpa had taught me to see what others missed. He'd shown me Kozlov's techniques, his signature methods, the tiny details that marked his work. And as I stared at the manuscript on Cox's table, I saw them all. The gold leaf application was too perfect, too uniform. Medieval scribes had worked with primitive tools, and their gold work always showed slight variations, tiny imperfections that spoke to the human hand behind the art. This was machine perfect. The ink color was wrong too. Kozlov had a tendency to make his blues slightly too vibrant, a result of using modern pigments that hadn't existed in the 9th century. To the untrained eye, it looked more authentic than not authentic. To someone who knew what to look for, it screamed forgery. But it was the calligraphy that sealed it. The letter formations were flawless, too flawless. Medieval scribes made tiny, consistent errors, a slightly uneven E, a D that leaned just a fraction too far to the right. Kozlov's work was perfect in a way that no human hand could achieve, because he used modern tools and techniques to create an idealized version of medieval writing. I was stood frozen by the table, watching Harrison Cox prepared to spend $100 million on a fake. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. Tina, when you know something is wrong, you have a moral obligation to speak up, regardless of the consequences. But what consequences would I face? I was a waitress interrupting $100 million deal between some of the most powerful people in the art world. They would think I was crazy, or worse, that I was trying to sabotage the deal for some ulterior motive. Cox was reaching for his pen, preparing to sign what I assumed were purchase agreements. I couldn't let it happen. Before I could say anything, Richard Cox looked up at me. He probably sensed the weird waitress frozen behind him. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The other men looked up at me with varying degrees of surprise and annoyance. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I continued, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it, "but I believe that manuscript is a forgery." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the dealers actually laughed. "I beg your pardon?" Cox said, his voice carefully controlled. "The manuscript, sir, it's not authentic. It's the work of a forgery named Viktor Kozlov." The dealer, who had laughed, now looked furious. "This is outrageous. Who is this person? How dare she?" Cox held up a hand, silencing the man. His eyes never left my face. "What's your name?" "Tina Bailey, sir." "And what makes you think you're qualified to authenticate a medieval manuscript, Miss Bailey?" My grandfather was Dr. Edmund Bailey. He was one of the world's leading experts on medieval documents until Viktor Kozlov destroyed his reputation with forgeries just like this one. I saw recognition flicker in Cox's eyes. He knew my grandfather's name. Dr. Bailey, he said slowly. I remember reading about his work. He made some serious accusations about forgeries in the art market. Accusations that were dismissed because he couldn't prove them. But he was right, and he taught me to recognize Kozlov's techniques. This is ridiculous, one of the other dealers interjected. We have 3 independent authentications. From experts who don't know what to look for, I said, my confidence growing. May I show you? Cox studied me for a long moment, then nodded. Show me. With trembling hands, I showed the details that confirmed my suspicions. Look at the gold-leafed work, I said, pointing to an illuminated capital letter. It's too uniform. Medieval scribes worked with primitive tools, and their gold application always showed slight variations. This is machine perfect. He leaned closer, studying the area I'd indicated. And here, I continued, pointing to a section of blue text. The pigment is too vibrant. This shade of ultramarine wasn't available to 9th century scribes. Kozlov always used modern pigments because they looked more authentic than the real thing. But the most telling sign, I said, my voice growing stronger, is the calligraphy itself. Look at these letter formations. They're flawless. No human hand, no matter how skilled, writes with this kind of mechanical precision. Kozlov used modern tools to create an idealized version of medieval script. Cox was studying the manuscript intently now, and I could see him beginning to notice the details I'd pointed out. These are very specific observations. How do you know so much about this particular forgerer's methods? Because my grandfather spent the last 10 years of his life studying Kozlov's work, trying to prove what everyone refused to believe. He taught me everything he knew about authentication, about the subtle differences between genuine medieval work and Kozlov's forgeries. And you're certain this is Kozlov's work? I'd stake my life on it. The dealers were growing increasingly agitated, but Cox seemed lost in thought. Finally, he looked up at me. Miss Bailey, I'm going to ask you to wait in the hallway while I discuss this with these gentlemen. My heart sank. I'd overstepped, and now I was going to be fired. But at least I'd tried to prevent a massive fraud. I waited in the hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, Cox emerged alone. The dealers have left, he said simply. I've postponed the purchase pending further authentication. I'm sorry if I overstepped, Mr. Cox. I know it wasn't my place. Miss Bailey, if you're right about this, you've just saved me from making a $100 million mistake. If you're wrong, I've lost the opportunity to acquire a priceless artifact. Either way, I need to know for certain. How will you find out? I'm going to have the manuscript examined by experts who specialize in detecting forgeries, but I want you there when they do it. Me? But I'm just a graduate student. You're the granddaughter of Dr. Edmund Bailey, and you've just demonstrated knowledge that 3 supposedly expert authenticators missed. I want your eyes on this examination. 3 days later, I found myself in a state-of-the-art laboratory at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, watching as experts subjected the manuscript to every test imaginable. Spectroscopic analysis of the inks, carbon dating of the parchment, microscopic examination of the calligraphy. Everything I had suggested they look for. Cox stood beside me, watching the process with the same intensity he'd shown at dinner. The preliminary results are troubling, Dr. Cora Parton, the museum's chief conservator, told us after 6 hours of testing. The parchment dates to the correct period, but the inks show traces of modern synthetic compounds. And the calligraphy. She paused, studying high-resolution photographs under a magnifying glass. Miss Bailey, could you show me again what you noticed about the letter formations? I pointed out the mechanical precision I'd observed, the lack of natural human variation that marked authentic medieval script. Extraordinary, Dr. Parton murmured. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I missed these details completely. The forger was incredibly skilled. Victor Kozlov. He's been creating forgeries like this for decades. We'll need to run more tests to be absolutely certain, Dr. Parton said. But based on what we found so far, I believe Miss Bailey is correct. This appears to be a very sophisticated forgery. Cox turned to me, his expression unreadable. It seems I owe you a considerable debt of gratitude. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Cox. I just couldn't stand by and watch you be defrauded. $100 million, Miss Bailey. You saved me from losing $100 million to a con artist. The final authentication results came back a week later, confirming what I'd suspected from the moment I saw the manuscript. It was indeed a Kozlov forgery, so sophisticated that it had fooled 3 expert authenticators and nearly convinced one of the world's most knowledgeable collectors. Cox called me personally to share the news. Miss Bailey, I'd like to meet with you to discuss your future. Your future? I have a proposition for you. Could you come to my office tomorrow afternoon? Cox's office was in a Manhattan skyscraper, occupying the entire top floor, with views that stretched to the horizon. But what took my breath away wasn't the view, it was the art. The walls were lined with masterpieces I'd only seen in textbooks. A Monet water lily painting, a small Picasso sketch, what appeared to be an original Van Gogh drawing. This wasn't just an office, it was a private museum. Impressive, isn't it? Cox said, noticing my amazement. But this is just the overflow. My main collection is housed in a facility in Connecticut. It's incredible, I breathed, studying a medieval illuminated manuscript that was definitely authentic. Miss Bailey, Tina, I want to offer you a job. I turned to face him, confused. A job? I need a curator for my collection. Someone with your eye for detail, your knowledge of authentication techniques, your ability to spot what others miss. Mr. Cox, I'm flattered, but I'm still in graduate school. I don't have the credentials. You have something more valuable than credentials. You have instinct, and you have training from one of the greatest authentication experts who ever lived. Your grandfather may have been discredited, but he was right about Kozlov, wasn't he? Yes, but I've done some research on Viktor Kozlov since our dinner. It turns out your grandfather wasn't the only expert who suspected him. There have been whispers in the art world for years, but no one could prove anything. Kozlov's work was too good, and he was too careful. What are you saying? I'm saying that I want to hire you not just as a curator, but as an investigator. I want you to help me identify other Kozlov forgeries in the market. I want you to help restore your grandfather's reputation by proving he was right all along. I don't understand. Why would you want to do that? Cox walked to the window, looking out over the city. Because the art world is built on trust, Tina. When forgers like Kozlov operate with impunity, they undermine that trust. They steal not just money, but history itself. And you think I can help stop that? I think you're the only person who can. Your grandfather taught you to see what others miss. That's a rare gift, and it shouldn't be wasted serving dinner to people who wouldn't recognize a masterpiece if it fell on them. What exactly are you offering? A full-time position as curator and authentication specialist for the Cox collection, a salary of $100,000 a year to start, plus benefits. I'll also pay off your student loans and fund your completion of your graduate degree. I stared at him in shock. $100,000 was more money I'd ever imagined making, especially straight out of graduate school. There's one more thing, Cox continued. I want to establish a foundation in your grandfather's name, the Dr. Edmund Bailey Foundation for Art Authentication. Its mission will be to train the next generation of experts to recognize and combat art forgery. You would be its first director. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. My grandfather had died believing he was a failure, that his life's work had been discredited. The idea of restoring his reputation, of honoring his memory with a foundation that would continue his fight against forgery, it was more than I had ever dared to hope for. Mr. Cox, I don't know what to say. Say yes, Tina. Help me build something that will protect the art world from people like Viktor Kozlov. Help me make sure that what happened to your grandfather never happens to another honest expert. Yes, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, absolutely yes. Over the following months, my life transformed completely. I left my job at Le Bernardine and moved into a beautiful apartment that Cox provided near his Connecticut facility. The Cox collection was even more impressive than I had imagined. Thousands of pieces, spanning centuries and cultures, all housed in a climate-controlled facility that rivaled any major museum. My first task was to examine every piece in the collection for potential forgeries. It was painstaking work, but I loved every minute of it. Using the techniques my grandfather had taught me, combined with modern scientific analysis, I was able to identify 3 pieces that showed signs of being Kozlov forgeries. 3 pieces out of over 2,000, Cox said when I presented my findings. That's actually better than I feared. The good news is that they're relatively minor pieces. The total value is maybe $2 million, not the $100 million you almost lost. Still, it proves your grandfather was right about Kozlov's reach in the market. The Dr. Edmund Bailey Foundation launched 6 months later with a gala that brought together experts from around the world. I gave a speech about my grandfather's work and his dedication to protecting the integrity of art authentication. Dr. Bailey understood that when we authenticate a work of art, we're not just verifying its monetary value, we're preserving history itself. Every genuine artifact tells us something about the people who created it, the time they lived in, the culture they were part of. When forgers create fake pieces, they're not just stealing money, they're stealing our connection to the past. After the gala, an elderly man approached me. He was well-dressed but moved with the careful steps of someone dealing with age and illness. "Miss Bailey," he said in a heavily accented voice, "I wanted to speak with you about your grandfather." "Of course. Did you know him?" The man smiled sadly. "In a way. My name is Viktor Kozlov." I felt the blood drain from my face. "I know what you're thinking," he continued quickly. "But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to apologize." "Apologize?" "I'm dying, Miss Bailey. I have perhaps 6 months left, and I wanted to make amends for the damage I caused." I stared at him, unsure how to respond. This frail, elderly man was the monster who had haunted my grandfather's final years? "Your grandfather was right about everything," Kozlov continued. "I did create forgeries, dozens of them, and when he tried to expose me, I used my connections in the art world to discredit him instead." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to help you finish what he started. I have records, Miss Bailey, documentation of every forgery I ever created, every piece I placed in the market, every expert I bribed or misled. I want to give it all to you." "Why would you do that?" Kozlov's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was a young man who thought I was cleverer than everyone else. I told myself I was creating art, that my forgeries were so beautiful they deserved to exist. But I was wrong. I was stealing history, just as you said in your speech tonight." "And my grandfather?" "Was the only expert honest enough and skilled enough to see through my work. I destroyed his reputation because I was afraid of being exposed. It's the greatest regret of my life." 2 weeks later, Kozlov delivered on his promise. He provided me with detailed records of 47 forgeries he had created over a 30-year career, including their current locations and the names of the collectors who owned them. "This is incredible," Cox said as we reviewed the documents. "Some of these pieces are in major museums, and some are in private collections that will never admit they were fooled. But at least now we know the truth." "What do you want to do with this information?" "I want to contact every owner, every museum, every collector. I want to give them the chance to have their pieces properly authenticated. And I want to make sure the world knows that my grandfather was right all along. The revelation of Kozlov's confession made international headlines. Museums around the world quietly removed pieces from display for re-authentication. Private collectors discovered that works they had treasured for years were sophisticated fakes. The art world was shaken, but it was also grateful for the truth. Most importantly, my grandfather's reputation was fully restored. Art history textbooks were updated to acknowledge his pioneering work in forgery detection. The techniques he had developed became standard practice in authentication labs around the world. A year after Kozlov's confession, I was invited to speak at the International Conference on Art Authentication. As I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience of the world's leading experts, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. My grandfather used to tell me that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried, I said. He spent his final years believing he had failed, that his life's work had been discredited. But he was wrong. The truth did surface, and his work is now recognized as groundbreaking. But this story isn't just about vindication. It's about the responsibility we all share to protect the integrity of art and history. When we authenticate a work, we're not just doing a job, we're serving as guardians of human culture. After my speech, a young graduate student approached me. She reminded me of myself just 2 years earlier, passionate about art history, but struggling to see how she could make a living in the field. "Miss Bailey," she said, "I'm working on my thesis about Renaissance forgeries. I was wondering if the Bailey Foundation offers internships." "We do," I said, smiling, "and we would love to work with someone with your passion for the truth." As I watched her face light up with excitement, I realized that this was perhaps the greatest gift Kozlov had given me. Not just a career, but the opportunity to continue my grandfather's work, to train the next generation of experts who would protect art and history from those who would exploit them. The waitress who had once served overpriced meals for wealthy collectors was now one of the most respected authentication experts in the world. But more importantly, I had helped restore my grandfather's legacy and created a foundation that would continue his fight for truth in the art world. Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come when we have the courage to speak up, even when we have everything to lose. That night at Le Bernardin, I risked my job to prevent a fraud. In return, I gained a career, a purpose, and the chance to honor the memory of the man who taught me that truth is always worth fighting for. An absolutely incredible story about courage, family legacy, and the power of speaking truth to power. What's your dream job? Share it in the comments below. If this story of hidden expertise, family vindication, and the courage to challenge authority moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more amazing stories about finding your calling and honoring those who came before us. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.